Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is John Quincy Adams, Part 3. Quincy Adams was the sixth President of the United States. We stopped last time in 1809, and he was in Russia as the U.S. ambassador with his wife, Louisa, and their very young son, Charles, and then they left behind the older two sons, George and John, back in Massachusetts. And they had some pretty hard times over there in Russia, and it was very, very cold, much cold. Massachusetts has pretty tough winters, but it was much tougher, colder and darker in St. Petersburg, which was the capital at that time. Very poor country. There was a lot of loneliness and sickness. They all got sick at the very beginning from dirty drinking water. They got dysentery, which was based on problems with sanitation. A lot of guys in war get dysentery for the same reason. So they were all sick. Louisa was pretty miserable, extremely miserable. She missed her two sons. And then John Quincy, in his work as U.S. ambassador, was required to attend all these diplomatic dinners, which often went till 4 in the morning. And it was a part of the aristocratic extravagance and dissipation in the old Russian Empire, which in part led to the communist revolution. And and then there was a lot of drinking involved, which was also problematic. By custom, they were required to have 14 servants, and to work for them, and these servants would steal. I guess this was part of the culture, since the country was so poor that stealing among the poor was kind of like supplementing their income, which was so meager. During his time in Russia, John Quincy Adams became very good friends with Russian Tsar Alexander I. They both enjoyed walking. Alexander the Tsar would be out walking with minimal security, and they would encounter each other. They both liked to walk. John Quincy was a lifelong walker and swimmer. He really couldn't swim in Russia. And John Quincy was able to get the Tsar's help because American ships had been detained by Denmark, and I think under the French influence, and then the Russians also had influence, and he was able to get these ships released. He was working on establishing free trade between the United States and Russia. As I said, the winters were very, very tough. And in the depth of winter, John Quincy could only see to write from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Very short, very few hours of sunlight in the winter. Of course, the opposite in the summer, he would be able to read and write at midnight. So that's interesting. He had this to say about St. Petersburg. John Quincy was out walking a lot, and he said this, quote, "The immense number of carriages constantly driving, and the violence with which they drive, keeps the walkers in perpetual hazard of being run over." So challenging walking conditions because of the narrow streets and apparently a lot of traffic with these carriages going here and there. In July of 1810, Louisa had another miscarriage, and this added to her depression. In December, she wrote this, quote, "We end this year in bad health and in worse spirits than ever. God help us. These honors are dearly bought." See, she was talking about the honors would be the honor that he had of being a U.S. ambassador, and he was again trying to promote trade with Russia. In 1811, John Quincy was nominated. He received word that he could, if he wanted to, he could be on the Supreme Court. He had that option. And his mom and dad knew about this, and they were, they assumed he would accept. They thought it was perfect, that he could spend the rest of his life on the Supreme Court. It would be job security for life, because those guys work until they die. And then he could be close to home. He could be back in the United States. He turned it down. He wasn't interested, because again, if you're on the Supreme Court, it's like a legal thing, and he thought it would be a very boring job, and it didn't interest him. And again, he was I guess he saw himself getting back into politics when he came back to the U.S. So they stayed on in Russia for several more years. So I think his mom and dad were very disappointed. In April and May, two of their two good friends died. Francis Dana, with whom he had gone to Russia when Dana was the first U.S. ambassador, when John Quincy had gone as his secretary when he was 14. William Emerson, also another friend, died, and they got learned. And then Nabby, his sister Nabby, had breast cancer. Louisa's sister, also during this time, Nancy, was 37, died in childbirth. So this was several sad things going on. And in August, Louisa gave birth to a girl that lived, whom they named Louisa as well. So they had 4 children, the 3 sons and the daughter. He was John. There was no schools there for their son Charles. And he was this little boy. He was 1 when they came, and so he was still very young. And John Quincy was his teacher. And little kids are very restless. It's kind of hard for them to buckle down and study when he was here, probably 2-3 years old. So John Quincy was trying to teach him, and he found that his son was very, very easily distracted. And it reminded him of himself. And he wrote this quote, "I find to this day the same thing in myself, and it is the greatest, perhaps the only cause which has found the voyage of my life in the shallows. True genius is nothing but the power of applying the mind to its object." Yeah, he's talking about concentration, how important it is to focus on one thing. My father used to always say that to me. Pete, you need to focus. And John Quincy, in his defense, was interested in so many different things, so that's partly why he kept changing the focus of his attention from one thing to another. The following year, in September, their baby Louisa died. She died of dysentery, and this was a consequence of living in Russia because, they had all gotten dysentery from the dirty drinking water, but they were adults, so they could survive it. Now she was just a baby. Little kids can't handle a disease that an adult could survive. So this was devastating. The death of their 1-year-old little girl, Louisa, and her mother was who had already been depressed especially about not being separated from the 2 sons. She wrote this quote, "I am a useless being in this world, and this last dreadful stroke has too fully convinced me what a burden I am become. Surely it is no crime to pray for death." And she had a severe depression for 6 months after this. You have to give Louisa Adams a lot of credit. She everything that she went through, she got, she overcame. Eventually, she overcame it. She had a lot of misery, a lot of depression, but she ended up living a good life, a good long life. In June, the War of 1812 started. James Madison was the U.S. president, and in July, and so John Quincy was in Russia when that happened. And in July, France invaded Russia. This was under Napoleon's leadership, and these are the events that were depicted in War and Peace, the novel by Leo Tolstoy. On the day that their daughter Louisa died, Moscow burned. The Russians had fires that they set in Moscow, and actually the French army entered into Moscow, and then these fires were lit, which made it harder for the French to live there and stay there. And it was a very dramatic time. And then, of course, the French army, the winter was coming, and they decided to retreat, and they were destroyed by the Russian winter. And that's also depicted in War and Peace. So now the Adams weren't really affected so much because the French never came to St. Petersburg. They came to Moscow. Their baby Louisa was buried in the graveyard in the Anglican Church in St. Petersburg. So by that year, 1813, they had been in Russia for 5 years, and in February they got news that his sister Nabby had died. And then there was talk about him coming back to the U.S. Because he'd been there long enough, and he was ready to come home. Louisa, who was still depressed, wrote this quote, "My heart is torn at the idea of quitting forever the spot where my darling lays, and to which my soul is linked. Yeah, she was feeling bad about leaving the graveyard or the grave of their daughter, baby daughter Louisa. And you have to wonder what happened to her grave. I'm not kind of curious about that because it was in the Anglican graveyard, and of course 100 years later they had the Russian Revolution, which tried to eliminate religion, and so the more you study history, the more questions that are answered. Whatever happened to the grave of John Quincy Adams' daughter Louisa in St. Petersburg? By April of 1814, it was decided John Quincy was sent to Ghent, Belgium, to be a part of the negotiations to end the War of 1812. And he left Louisa and their son Charles back in St. Petersburg. So this was a long trip. He traveled through Holland, and he arrived in Ghent, Belgium. By this time, France had been defeated, and Russia and Tsar Alexander were very popular in Western Europe because, basically all of Europe was enemies with France because of the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution. And, they'd been defeated in France, so this was a great victory for Great Britain and so forth. So now one of the things, so he was in Ghent, Belgium. John Quincy traveled, and he was negotiating with the British. One of the things they were trying to get was to get the British to stop the impressment, stop kidnapping American sailors. But the British were very stubborn. They would not give in on that point. He worked with Henry Clay, who was also there as a part of the American team. And finally, the treaty was signed in December of 1814. To end the War of 1812, and British impressment was not ended. They were very different guys, John Quincy and Henry Clay, and John Quincy Adams. And during their negotiations with the British, at one point, Clay criticized one of the British diplomats as, quote, a man of irritation. And then John Quincy Adams responded, "Irritability is the word, Mr. Clay, irritability." So he was correcting his use of words. He used the wrong use of that word, or the wrong form. So by January of 1815, John Quincy sent word to Louisa that she and Charles should come and meet him in Paris. And so he was in Belgium, and they both made their way to Paris, and he didn't have that far to go. On the way, he stopped in Brussels to enjoy the art of Van Dyck and Leonardo da Vinci. And then he arrived in Paris before her, and he had this to say, quote, "The tendency to dissipation seems to be irresistible." Dissipation meaning all drinking, eating, drinking, and so forth, and staying up late. Now at this time, Napoleon, had been defeated. He was a prisoner on the island of Elba in the Mediterranean off the coast of Italy. Meanwhile, John Quincy and Louisa and Charles were on their way, making a very long trip. And meanwhile, John Quincy was he went to enjoy Mozart's Figaro at the Odeon. So I think that was a classical music performance. Now, Louisa's route to Paris, she passed through Riga in what's now Latvia, Königsberg, Berlin, Leipzig, Frankfurt, and Strasbourg. Very tough trip. And during that time, actually, Napoleon regained power. He had this charisma and so forth, and he got off Elba and started with a small group of guys, and he was supposed to be arrested, and all these guys defected back to him, the French army. They were very loyal to him, and he regained power. So the French were they were actually pretty mad at the Russians for all of the French soldiers who had died in Russia, during that retreat in the Russian winter. So when Louisa crossed the frontier from Russia into France, she almost got killed by French troops who thought she was a Russian, and they were so mad from the war. But and so that was a very dangerous time, but she convinced them that she wasn't Russian, and she made her way to Paris. And actually, by the time she got to Paris, Napoleon himself was in Paris as well. So there was a happy reunion, in Paris between John Quincy, Louisa, and Charles. They'd been separated for almost a year. To back up a little bit, before John Quincy came to Paris, this time he spent in Brussels, Belgium, he visited art collections and a library where he spent hours devouring paintings by the famous painters, Dutch and Flemish tremendous painters such as Holbein, Rembrandt, Rubens, and Van Dyck. So they were in Paris. John Quincy and Louisa were in Paris. So they went to the Theater Francais. They went and a play was being performed, Tragedy of Hector, because it had been requested by Napoleon. And when they were there at this performance, and Napoleon arrived as well, and the crowd was delirious. There was pandemonium. Even though so many people had died because of Napoleon, but he remained extremely popular. And John Quincy wrote this quote, "Never at any public theater did I witness such marks of public veneration and such bursts of enthusiasm for any crowned head as that evening for Napoleon." By April, John Quincy had been appointed U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. So in May, the family traveled to London. Now, they'd been gone for 6 years by this time. And so it was decided that the two sons, George, who was now 14, and John, who was 12, should come to them, because then they could study. Separation was way too long, and they could study in England. So they had this happy reunion in England. And John Quincy was one day he was trying to teach his sons how to fire a gun, but he overloaded it. And when he fired it, it exploded, and he was badly burned in his hand and in his eyes. Some of this debris went into his eyes, so he had severe health troubles because of this gun accident. He couldn't write, and he had eye trouble. His eyes were bloodshot and inflamed, and there was discharges coming from his eyes because of this. Some of this matter had gone into his eyes from the gun explosion. He could not read, the thing he loved more than anything. And he described his eyes as he said this, quote, "Thick, purulent matter oozed out slowly." He was confined for weeks in a dark room because his eyes couldn't handle the light. And he said this to say about this experience, quote, "It was now that I knew how to estimate the blessing of eyesight and the wretchedness of being bereft of it." Now remember, over the years, Louisa had considerable health trouble and depression and these miscarriages, and John Quincy was actually very good in taking care of her and comforting her. Now this was her chance to take care of him and to read out loud to him because he couldn't read, and also take dictation so that he could write letters and she could write them down. Part of the treatment that he had for his eye problems by a doctor included leeches. The leeches are like an animal, or like they're what would you call them? An insect. These slimy things. So the doctor was using leeches, these slimy things. They're kind of like worms, and if you're out in the water and you get one on your leg, they'll suck your blood. And he wrote this about the experiences of having leeches applied to his eyes to help, I guess, to suck out this matter that was in his eyes. And he wrote, quote, "I was nearly delirious. It seemed to me as if 4 hooks were tearing that side of my face into 4 quarters." Very tough. Finally, by January of 1816, his health had recovered so that he could go to his office. That same year, he wrote this, quote, "May our country be always successful, but whether successful or otherwise, always right." This is what he believed in very, very strongly, is doing the right thing. And, the thing that troubled him so much during this time and for many years, for the rest of his life, was slavery, because slavery was wrong. And he felt bad about that. So he was U.S. ambassador for a couple of years until 1817 under President Madison. And in that year, there was a new incoming president, James Monroe, and he had gotten word. There was talk that he would be Secretary of State. Now, meanwhile, he had been He had been tutoring he tutored George for a while, tried to tutor him. And George and John were not hard workers. They were not good students. And he was their father was very disappointed. And he wrote this quote, "I am aware that no labor will ever turn a pebble into a diamond if the pursuit of knowledge is not a passion which will seek its own gratification." Well, they had some, early on they had this adjustment to make, and then these poor boys hadn't been with their parents for 6 years, and then, John Quincy was a hard driving guy, and then they actually had some good times for a while in England, where he decided just to accept them for who they were, that they were not, weren't going to be brilliant thinkers, or they weren't him or his father, and they had some good times together, which was nice, because things changed when they got back to the U.S. He was writing poetry. This was a lifelong thing. John Quincy and his love of Shakespeare continued. In April of 1817, he was appointed U.S. Secretary of State under James Monroe, and so they were coming back to the U.S. after 8 years in Europe, and he never returned. Now, this position, Secretary of State, means you're in charge of international affairs for the U.S., and 3 presidents had used that as a springboard to the presidency. Thomas Jefferson had been Secretary of State, and then he became president. Same thing with James Madison and James Monroe. So this was really the top position in government. And his years, his many years overseas had helped him to really have a sense of being American. Not so much as a guy from Massachusetts. His loyalty was to the whole country. And because I think this happens, when you go overseas. And he was proud of being from Massachusetts, but he wrote this quote, "But the longer I live, the stronger I find my national feelings grow upon me, and the less of my affections are compassed by partial localities. My system of politics more and more inclines to strengthen the Union and its government." Yeah, so remember earlier, he'd also done the same thing. He had done things that were unpopular politically in New England because he believed they were right. And he's similar to his father. They both believed in doing the right thing. So in 1817, they spent some time in Quincy, the family home in Massachusetts. Biographer Paul C. Nagel wrote this quote, "It was a special moment of triumph for Louisa, where once she had been coldly treated by a scornful Abigail Adams. Now the matriarch embraced her with affection and admiration, particularly for the courage she had shown in traveling with little Charles from St. Petersburg to Paris." Yeah, that was nice. Earlier, Abigail didn't approve of Louisa. She thought, who's this English-born woman? And she thought she was going to be real high society or difficult or a snob or whatever. But this trip, this incredible trip that she had made alone with their little boy, and where they almost got killed by the French army entering France. John Quincy Adams served as Secretary of State for the next 8 years, from 1817 to 1825. A lot things had, our country was changing. This is how the world's always changing, especially nowadays, and back then as well. And when he arrived in New York City, he was very popular, and he saw the new, the big innovation was the steamboat, a boat which could travel against the wind, which did not require wind power, and you could travel without any wind or against the wind. So this was wonderful. There was a lot of pressure on him, people looking for jobs, and as Secretary of State, he had that responsibility of hiring people. And had a very happy reunion with his parents in Boston. And in September, he started working as Secretary of State in Washington City. And he wrote this quote, "I cannot ask of heaven success, even for my country, in a cause where she should be in the wrong." Same idea, believed in doing what was right. And he started overworking, which was a tendency, and he started, they'd had good times in England. He'd had good times with his sons, where he accepted them and they enjoyed being together. And now he started being real hard on his sons again, which was ultimately very tragic. After arriving in Washington City, he met with President Monroe. They talked about the job and what he'd be doing. And he came home at midnight exhilarated. And you'd think you go to bed at a kind of time like that and get some rest. But no, at midnight he wrote a poem honoring the moment in his career. And he wrote this quote, "O God, my only trust was thou. through all life's scenes before. Lo, at thy throne again I bow, new mercies to implore. You gotta love John Quincy Adams writing a poem at midnight celebrating becoming Secretary of State. In the spring of 1818, there had been ongoing problems with Florida, which was a Spanish colony and very weakly governed. The Seminole Indians were the main Indians in Florida, and a lot of African American slaves had escaped in the Deep South and gone to Florida, where they joined the Seminole Indians. And Seminole Indians and these African Americans had been going on raids into Georgia. They cross the border and steal horses and things, and then go back into Florida. And they thought, well, we're safe because they can't catch us in Florida. It's an international border. So finally, Americans were getting fed up. The U.S. Army was sent into Florida under the leadership of Andrew Jackson. Now, this became controversial because his mandate was just to try to capture the individuals involved in these raids. But he did a lot more than that, Jackson and the Army. And they actually arrested a couple British guys who they believe were involved in these raids, who were trading with the Seminole Indians. And Jackson had them executed as traitors. And then there was considerable fighting. And eventually there was a U.S. occupation of Florida. And his actions were very controversial. And a lot of folks were critical of Andrew Jackson. However, John Quincy Adams was very, very supportive. And the U.S. occupation of Florida under Jackson's leadership led to Florida becoming part of the U.S. And Jacksonville, the city of Jacksonville, was named after Andrew Jackson in gratitude for his role. The Spanish were very upset, but again, they were not governing this territory properly. The British were upset, but anyways, eventually this led to the purchase of Florida. That same year, John Quincy Adams wrote a report on weights and measures, and he put a lot of time in this. There's this problem of, with trade and when buying and selling, what's the measure, when people buy things, it's based on weight or length and so forth. And depending on the region, people have different ideas about these things. So it was, we really needed a uniform measurements so that to have less conflict and, it would be better for business, better for our country. So he did a lot of research, and he really got carried away with it. And his final report recommended what became the metric system, which is used in Europe. He didn't originate the metric system, but he learned about it, and he recommended it for American use, although it actually really hasn't been adopted here, although worldwide it has. In 1818, John Quincy Adams wrote this, quote, "My friends earnestly urge me to mingle more in society and to make myself more extensively known. I am scarcely ever satisfied with myself after going into company, and always have the impression that my time at home is more usefully spent." See, the thing, he was a politician, and they were already seeing him. His friends saw him as becoming the next president, and they said, "You got to go out more and talk with people and to get support." And the thing is, like we've talked about, he loved reading books. He was an intellectual, and socializing can be very boring, just making small talk with people. So he's a man after my own heart. He was having personal difficulties, and as well during this time. We're out of time. Thank you so much for watching. We will continue next time with the fascinating life of John Quincy Adams. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Hope you find a good history book to read. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.